What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with the box office breakdown for Sunday, July 26th, where the Odyssey is not only continuing to do well in its second weekend, the numbers it's generating would be fantastic even if this was the opening weekend. So here are some stats for you to digest. The Odyssey grossed $87 million domestic in its second weekend, which represents a 30% drop from its opening weekend. That's nuts. Oppenheimer fell 43% in its second weekend, and it opened far lower. But that's a bigger second weekend than The Dark Knight, which adjusted for inflation grossed $75 million in its second weekend back in the summer of 2008. But internationally, this is where the real action is happening, because to date, worldwide, the Odyssey has already amassed a global tally of $639 million. That's more than last year's Superman did in its entire run. And at a time where most superhero movies feel really stale and really lazy, like last week's trailer that we saw for Doomsday, perhaps this is going to open the door to more sword and sandal movies and/or more mythology movies, whether they're Norse mythology or Greek mythology or Egyptian mythology or whatever the case might be. And just to give you an example of the kind of movie that I would like to see, if Robert Eggers were to announce tomorrow that he wanted to make a proper movie about the story of Theseus, using the entire story of Theseus and not just the name of the character like we saw in the movie The Immortals, I'd be all over that, because that would combine Robert Eggers' love and affection for horror and monsters, but also Greek mythology. But fingers crossed, there'll be some filmmakers out there who look at the success of the Odyssey and say to themselves, you know what, I want to do the story of Jason and the Argonauts, because just Greek mythology alone could keep a lot of filmmakers busy for many years. But if you start incorporating Roman history and the history of the Roman Empire, I mean, basically it's an inexhaustible resource. I mean, look at a show like Rome on HBO like 20 years ago. It only got 2 seasons. It could have gone for 20. But getting back to the success of the Odyssey, keep in mind, this is an R-rated movie, and I feel like between the success of the Odyssey and the success of Obsession this year, both movies have obviously done really, really well. But hopefully we can put to bed once and for all this loathsome trend where every movie has to be a family-friendly, PG-13, just river of diarrhea in order to generate big numbers. But what's interesting about the Odyssey's ongoing success is finally seeing all the fence sitters out there getting off the fence and taking the plunge and watching the movie. Because you can't sustain these numbers with just repeat business of all the Christopher Nolan fans out there. You need to get fresh audience members into the theater. And for the first week of the movie's release, I had several family members who kept texting me, and they were debating, like, should I go? When should I go? Where should I go? Blah, blah, blah. And I kept telling them, this movie's crossed over into like a massive cultural event, whether you're a diehard movie fan or a casual movie fan, or you're watching no movies at all, and whether you love it or you hate it, or you're completely indifferent to it, you need to form your own opinion, because you can't just regurgitate all the things you've heard on social media. If you want to feel cool, if you want to feel like you're a part of the conversation, well, then you need to form your own opinion and go to the theater. So finally, my mother, my sister, my niece, they all packed in the car, and they went to check out the flick. But as a lifelong fan of mythology and fantasy, I've loved watching over the last week or two the ongoing debate online about which movie adaptations to watch, which translations to read, and my social media feeds have been filled with discussions of classic Greek mythology adaptations like Jason and the Argonauts and Ulysses, which are 2 of my personal favorites. And I think when the dust from this movie is finally settled, there will be more mythology readers out there now than there were before, and I regard that as a net positive. And what's been really interesting to see is how some people with opposing views are finding common ground when it comes to discussing Christopher Nolan's adaptation, because I've always avoided reading Emily Wilson's 2017 translation of the Odyssey, because it includes modern dialogue and it softens a lot of the more graphic and cruel ingredients in the original story. And yet, she said something about Nolan's film that I totally agreed with. And a lot of her comments have been going viral on social media, but one of her big complaints or big grievances was the absence of the gods of Mount Olympus. And I know Athena's there through like some sort of post-traumatic stress kind of head trauma, but if you read the Odyssey, one of the big opening scenes is when the gods of Mount Olympus are all hanging out, and they're like, you know what, maybe it's time for Odysseus to finally get a chance to go home, because at that time, Poseidon's off partying with the Ethiopians. Like, well, Poseidon's not around right now, so since he can't object and he can't get pissed off, maybe it's time to tell Calypso to let Odysseus go home. Because Calypso, contrary to how she's depicted in the movie, in the text, she has captured Odysseus. He is her love prisoner, but they send Hermes down there to tell her, it's time to let Odysseus go home. And so I would have loved to have seen those kinds of scenes, but obviously Nolan, let's just say he's not into like divine, supernatural beings and that sort of thing. But another complaint Emily Wilson had was that she wanted to see the crafty, more humorous side of Odysseus, which was totally lacking from the movie. But perhaps her biggest critique of Nolan's interpretation of the text is that so much of the movie is about shame and grief, and trauma as opposed to great deeds and glory. So who knows, even though I've never been interested in reading Emily Wilson's translation, because she and I see eye to eye in so many ingredients of Nolan's movie, perhaps I will have to dust off her 2017 translation as opposed to constantly rereading the Robert Fagles translation, which I prefer. In any case, even though I do have my petty grievances toward the movie, I remain absolutely in awe of the movie's success, and I hope that enthusiasts of high adventure will continue to debate the pros and cons of the movie for a very long time. But the big question now is what's going to happen when Spider-Man swings back onto the screen later this week? Because Spider-Man Brand New Day is projected to have a worldwide opening of more than $500 million. And that might sound like a lot of money, but keep in mind, Spider-Man No Way Home opened to $600 worldwide. But obviously that movie had the added bonus of 3 different Spider-Man characters in the same movie.
I didn't know you could get that big.
Will Spidey chew up the Odyssey and spit it out, or will they kind of help each other and dovetail nicely and get more people to the theater for both movies? Because usually if I have a great movie-going experience, well, then I'm excited to have another, and I go back to the theater very, very quickly. If I have a dog shit movie-going experience, I'm like, ugh, I don't want to go to the movies anymore. But I suspect that the two movies are going to coexist peacefully, with the Odyssey continuing to do monster business on premium screens while Spidey takes over everything else. Because this is a rare situation with the Odyssey where most of the box office is being driven by a handful of premium screens as opposed to like a big wide release across thousands of theaters. And I suspect that a lot of kind of big premium prestige movies in the future will follow that model where it's like, let's do all of our business in like the Dolby and IMAX screens and not worry about the rest of the screens. But I'll have a better idea about Spider-Man's box office prospects after I see and review the movie on Wednesday. But sadly, I'm not going to get a chance to cover Spider-Man's box office next weekend because I'm going to be out west for this big family excursion in honor of my mother's birthday. And obviously the conversation about Spider-Man's box office will continue into its second and third week, etc. and so forth. But I suspect that next weekend is going to be the biggest box office weekend of the year so far. If you combine the Odyssey's premium screens with Spider-Man's perhaps $500 million plus opening, it's going to be the biggest opening weekend of the year, probably right up until Dune Part 3 and Doomsday hit the screen at the same time. Because even though I thought the trailer for Doomsday looked like pure ass, no one can deny that movie's going to open to giant numbers, and I suspect that Dune Part 3 is going to open to some pretty goddamn good numbers as well. But with the ongoing success of the Odyssey, it'd be easy to overlook the fact that there are a couple new releases this past weekend, and there were smaller movies without the same fanfare and acclaim, but we had Motor City starring Alan Ritchson, a.k.a. Reacher, which is basically what I've heard is like an homage to 70s era, like cop thrillers and revenge thrillers and that sort of thing. And the movie has the added kind of experimental gimmick where there's almost no dialogue. What I've heard is that there's basically only like 10 minutes of dialogue in it. And I was excited to go, but I made this classic amateur mistake of reading reviews, which I should never do, because if I'm already excited to go, I should just go and I should just review it. But if I start reading reviews, A, I might lose interest, but B, there's always a chance that even if it's unintentional, I might borrow or steal or copy some of their talking points and that sort of thing. But I've heard from some people that Motor City kicks all kinds of ass. Other people have said it's basically like a cool experiment that stretches out for way too long. In any case, Motor City opened to $1.625 million in 1,600 theaters. I don't know what IFC was hoping for, but Alan Ritchson, he can't play Reacher forever, even though I know there are like a million of those books. But I would love to see Alan Ritchson making more movies as opposed to more TV shows, just because I'm more interested in movies as opposed to shows. But we also had Nicholas Winding Refn's new movie, Her Private Hell, which was distributed by Neon in 675 theaters. And if you're interested in my review, I'll post a link down in the description below. But that movie opened to $530,000, which marked a little bit of a decline from his previous movie, Neon Demon. But it makes sense. He hasn't made a movie in 10 years. And sometimes absence makes the heart grow fonder, but he's been making some shows like, what the hell is it, Too Old to Die Young, as well as Copenhagen Cowboy, but with an individual like Nicholas Winding Refn, where he enjoys a little animosity and pushback from the audience. He kind of like cultivates a persona where he's kind of daring you to both dislike him and his movies, and I'm like, well, be careful, because sometimes if you overplay your hand, you end up with a movie that opens to $530,000 as opposed to being your big triumphant return. My personal opinion is that he is a wildly talented filmmaker whose personality to me is totally, completely obnoxious, and opinions may vary, and that's totally fine, but I was hoping that Her Private Hell would just be this juggernaut, or at least a juggernaut by Refn standards, but it looks like this movie is going to die a relatively painful death. But if you love exquisite photography and you love Sophie Thatcher, the movie's 100% worth seeing. But as always with my breakdowns, I like to get the input and the analysis of the experts. So let's head over to Variety, where Rebecca Rubin has an article titled Box Office: The Odyssey's Sales to $87 million in Massive Second Weekend. The Odyssey continued its epic box office journey, scoring a sensational $87 million from 3,943 American theaters in its second weekend of release. That's a tally that most films, especially of the R-rated variety, would be happy to earn in their opening weekends. Ticket sales for The Odyssey declined just 30% from its sizable $123.5 million debut, a testament to the box office durability of director Christopher Nolan. Most tentpoles that open above $100 million would decline by 50% or more in subsequent weekends. Plus, R ratings can limit a film's audience because they prevent most people under 18 from buying a ticket. To that end, the turnout for The Odyssey represents the second biggest sophomore outing for an R-rated movie after Disney's Deadpool and Wolverine, which earned $96 million in its second weekend after launching to a record-setting $221 million domestically. After 2 weekends in theaters, Nolan's big-budget adaptation of Homer's epic poem, starring Matt Damon as the Greek king Odysseus, has grossed $286.4 million in North America and $639.6 million globally. The Odyssey will be tested next weekend with the release of Spider-Man Brand New Day. Sony's Marvel Adventure, starring Tom Holland and Zendaya, could distract audiences. However, exhibitors are positively euphoric about the prospect of 2 massively popular movies to propel the typically slow month of August. Once or twice a year, a movie opens big and then plays for weeks and weeks, says David A. Gross, who publishes the box office newsletter franchise Re. The Odyssey is showing that kind of holding power. The Odyssey has been a force in IMAX, which makes sense because it's the first feature shot entirely with the company's high-tech cameras. Since IMAX cameras are loud, cumbersome, and expensive, most movies are shot digitally and utilize IMAX only for certain action sequences. So far, The Odyssey has generated $140 million globally in IMAX, including $78 million domestically and $62 million internationally. IMAX's coveted 70mm screens, of which there are only 41 in the world, contributed $5.2 million over the weekend and $16.9 million to date, representing 12.1% of the total IMAX box office. Since cinephiles know that IMAX 70mm is Nolan's preferred format, most of those showtimes are sold out into September. The Odyssey has crossed over from hit blockbuster to global cultural events as IMAX's CEO Richard Gelfond. Our results indicate that audiences around the world will line up to experience this one-of-a-kind film in IMAX for weeks, if not months to come. With euphoric word-of-mouth and outsized interest in premium large formats, The Odyssey is expected to remain a major draw throughout the summer and into the fall. It'll wind up among the highest-grossing releases of the year. That prospect, along with the promise of Oscar nominations and the bragging rights of working with Nolan, the most bankable director of his generation, will easily justify the film's price tag for Universal. The studio spent a staggering $250 million to produce and around $125 million to promote the movie. The Odyssey wasn't the only movie inspired by Greek mythology to land among the top 5 at the weekend box office. Hades Town, the musical, a filmed version of the very successful Broadway show, had a strong debut with $9.6 million from 1,949 theaters. To compare, a theatrical version of Hamilton earned $10.1 million from 1,825 screens, while Broadway live captures of favorites like Waitress the Musical and Merrily We Roll Along opened at $2.6 million and $1.3 million, respectively. Hades Town, a folk operatic retelling of the Greek myth of Orpheus, a musician who ventures into the underworld to rescue his fiancée Eurydice, was supposed to play in theaters for just 5 days. Given the positive reviews and popular demand, though, Crosswalk and LD Entertainment, which released Hades Town with Bleecker Street, are extending the run with plans to add additional dates and showtimes. You know what, I just thought of something? If somebody were to make a really cool movie version of the story of Orpheus, it could explode. And there have been adaptations in the past, like Jean Cocteau did a modern-day retelling of it in the early 50s. But with Orpheus, you get high adventure because he joins Jason and the Argonauts on the quest for the Golden Fleece. But it's also really sad and really beautiful, and obviously because it's Orpheus, it would incorporate a lot of music. So if anybody out there is listening, if they love tragic, dark tales of going into the underworld and also tales of high adventure, but also killer music, Orpheus is waiting for a fresh adaptation. But back to the article. Disney's Moana and Toy Story 5 captured second and third place on box office charts. Moana earned $10.5 million from 4,015 locations in its third weekend, a modest 40% decline. So far, the live-action version of the studio's animated adventure has generated $102.5 million in North America and $228.2 million worldwide. Disney spent $250 million to reimagine the oceanic set movie. So Moana will struggle to swim to profitability in its theatrical run. run. Moana might not inspire a live-action sequel, but Disney has plenty to celebrate now that Toy Story 5 is the highest-grossing movie of the year, with $1.022 billion globally. The animated Five Cool added $10 million from 3,375 domestic theaters in its sixth outing, a mere 27% decline from the prior weekend, with grosses at $448.6 million in North America and $573.5 million internationally. Toy Story 5 is poised to notch another box office benchmark. It'll soon overtake its predecessor, 2019's Toy Story 4, $1.07 billion, as the biggest installment in the beloved Pixar franchise. And let me pause to interrupt with a question, because the Odyssey is already at $639 million globally. Is it possible that the Odyssey might outperform Toy Story 5 at the global box office? Because it looks like Toy Story 5 is going to stop around like 1.1. But the Odyssey, if it maintains this momentum, it's going to like 1.2, which I would have thought would be inconceivable in advance of the summer, because Batman is just obviously a much more popular character, and I would just assume that Dark Knight Rises would always be Nolan's most popular movie, but it remains to be seen. But what will be the most popular movies of the year? Is it going to be Brand New Day? Will it be Doomsday? Will it be The Odyssey? I mean, I think Dune Part 3 might be the best blockbuster, but I don't think it'll be the most popular blockbuster. In any case, yeah, The Odyssey just continues to defy all expectations. But let's wrap up the article. Universal and Illumination's Minions and Monsters tied with Hadestown for the number 4 spot at the domestic box office. Minions and Monsters also brought in $9.6 million over the weekend, boosting its domestic tally to $155 million after 4 weekends on the big screen. The animated prequel has earned $411 million globally, which is significant against its $85 million budget. However, recent entries in the Despicable Me franchise have neared or surpassed the $1 billion mark with ease, meaning the newest Minions may end up as the lowest grossing in the series. Given the diminishing returns, Universal and Illumination, which have cranked out a new Despicable Me adventure about every 2 years since the original 2010 film, may want to wait a bit before Gru and his highlighter yellow underlings return to theaters. After this weekend, the summer box office has cleared $3 billion and has roughly a month to cross the coveted $4 billion milestone, a feat that's only been accomplished once since COVID upended the industry. With overall domestic revenues 10% above 2025, according to Rentrack, exhibitors are bullish that yearly grosses could hit $10 billion for the first time in the post-pandemic era. It has truly been a vindicating stretch for movie theaters, especially after years of naysayers suggesting the theatrical experience was headed toward extinction. Since Rentrack's head of marketplace trends, Paul DeGarbettian, this moment offers another powerful reminder of the unique appeal of the big screen experience. So that's all the news that's fit to print for this weekend, but let's go ahead and make a prediction for Spider-Man Brand New Day, which is coming up this week. Spider-Man No Way Home opened to $600 million worldwide a couple of years ago, but that obviously had Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire and a bunch of villains to kind of sweeten the package. But I think right now, because movie attendance is up and people are excited due to the Odyssey, I think it's easier to pack them into a theater if people are already back in the habit of going on a regular basis. So I'm going to predict that Spider-Man Brand New Day is going to open to around 550 worldwide. But sadly, I will not get to report on it next weekend because I'll be hanging off a cliff in Wyoming somewhere and trying not to let my hand split open. I've been getting into rock climbing lately, and so I'm very excited to climb on some rocks out west. And I've been watching so many documentaries about rock climbing over the last month or two, I suspect it won't be long before I have to post a video of my top 10 favorite documentaries about the wonderful sport of rock climbing. But I think that's all I've got to say for this week, so I'm looking forward to reviewing Spidey in a few days' time. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting the notification bell, becoming a member, all that good stuff. Hope everybody has an amazing week, and I'll be back in your face in a few days' time. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.